Isn't found soon. What next? The Taoiseach says it'll be time for Plan B, but how big a role could Dublin have in any alternative arrangements? Welcome to The View. Tonight,
I think we've spent about the guts of a year trying to figure out what the backup Plan B would be, and we're not able to do that either.
Leo Varadkar has talked about Plan B often enough, but we still don't know what he really means. We've been down to Dublin to see if anyone else does.
Working together is the only thing that's in. You can call it what you want.
We'll be discussing what alternative arrangements might look like if Stormont doesn't return. Plus, the Nordies versus Mexicans debate.
When I go up north, I'm seen as a Mexican, and when I'm in the south, I'm seen as a Nordie. So I belong everywhere and nowhere.
Just how Irish is a Northern Irish person? It's got to the point where not only is Paddy Keelty's hosting of the Late Late Show up for debate, but also his choice of Northern guests. Hello. So, Plan A, where the DUP agrees to drop its Stormont boycott, looks increasingly unlikely every time Jeffrey Donaldson opens his mouth. Where next then? The Taoiseach Leo Varadkar says that work on a Plan B needs to start straight away if there's no agreement to return to Stormont this autumn. In a moment, I'll be discussing what that might mean with my guests in the studio. But first, we sent Darren Marshall to get the view from Dublin.
Last week, Leo Varadkar once again floated the idea of Plan B, and he was swiftly slapped down by Chris Heaton-Harris. So I'm off to Dublin to try and answer two questions. One, what exactly does the Taoiseach mean when he talks about Plan B? And secondly, is that criticism from Chris Heaton-Harris that domestic politics are at play justified?
If it's the case that the institutions can't be re-established in the autumn, well then I do think at that point we have to start having conversations about alternatives, about Plan B. We do need to sit down at some point and talk about what alternative arrangements can be put in place within the confines of the Good Friday Agreement. There is going to come a point where we can't keep waiting.
I think devolution can be restored, and to be frank, I don't think it'd be a Plan B, because we'd be whatever was happening, we'd be constantly trying to make sure that the executive got back up and running.
So the Taoiseach's out of the country at the moment, but one of the senior Fine Gael ministers in government is due to hold a press conference very shortly, so we'll hopefully get a word with him after that. Perhaps it'd be useful if you were able to elaborate on what Plan B might be, or what Plan B definitely won't be.
Well, look, that's very much a matter for the government overall to consider and to work in conjunction and to engage with the Prime Minister Sunak on that matter. Our focus continues to be on what role we can play in the Good Friday and the Stormont institutions being restored, and allowing the political environment within Northern Ireland to be further developed beyond where it is. We hope that can happen. We'll play our role in making that happen, and it's only in the consequence of that not happening then we have to consider what the future could be.
And look, you've served as a Fine Gael Director of Elections in the past. When Chris Heaton-Harris says the Taoiseach has domestic politics in his head when he's talking about Plan B, is there an electoral spin-off, is there an electoral advantage for Fine Gael ministers to be talking about Plan B or their Northern Ireland policy?
The only focus of the Taoiseach and the Government of Ireland when we talk about the challenges and the opportunities of Northern Ireland, it is what is best for the communities of Northern Ireland.
So here at Leinster House there's a bit of a back to school feeling with protesters, with TDs coming back. Gavin Riley, this is your bread and butter, the politics of this place. I spent a couple of days trying to work out what Dublin thinks Plan B is.
Yeah.
Can you shed any light on it?
I think we've spent about the guts of a year trying to figure out what the backup plan B would be, and we're not able to do that either. The only bit of clarification that we've been able to get, which may or may not be of comfort to some people north of the border, is that when Leo Varadkar talks about plan B, he's refined what he originally said, and now it's within the confines of the Good Friday Agreement. But Good Friday Agreement is already pretty clear as to what the plan B would be. It would be some kind of intergovernmental conference where Dublin has more of a consultative role in what's going on, but London makes the final say.
So the opinion polls down here in Dublin have Sinn Féin streaks ahead of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. The most recent one in the Business Post this weekend said Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael stagnant while Sinn Féin streaks ahead. Michael Brennan, you're the political editor of the Business Post. Does Northern Ireland, parties' policies on Northern Ireland, register with voters?
The reality is that you can hear the protest behind us there, the start of the new Dáil term. All the issues are bread and butter issues of cost of living, of high mortgage interest rates. Northern Ireland and the issue of unification, it's usually a very distant issue in Irish politics. It's big for Sinn Féin, but it doesn't generally feature on the radar here on a regular basis.
Hello.
Thank you very much.
How are you?
Not too bad.
Good to see you.
Mary Lou McDonald, I've come down to Dublin to try and find out what the Irish government thinks Plan B should be. Have you any idea what Leo Varadkar means?
It means joint action by both governments. In its put at its most basic level, it means that any notion that in the absence of Plan A working, and Plan A is the best outcome, the Good Friday Agreement institutions functioning, that you would simply relapse to simply London making decisions, a singularity like that, that's not going to happen.
So direct rule of the past is out?
That's out of the question. That's out of the question. I think any thoughtful, sensible person realises that the progress that has been made over the last decades has been built on the premise of working together.
But joint authority is also out.
Well, working together is the only thing that's in. You can call it what you want, but essentially the process works and people's needs are met, and we make progress on the basis of the two governments joined together. Now, I don't head the government. I'm not leading this government.
But if this rumbles on long enough, you may well head the government. What would Mary Lou McDonald's Plan B look like?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily helpful at this point to kind of project into the future of what I might or might not do. I think it's more productive to make statements about the current state of play. And in this current scenario, number one, both governments and all parties need to now really move decisively to get the institutions back up and running. That's the best outcome.
Mary Lou McDonald ending that view from Dublin. Let's talk about this now with columnist and commentator Newton Emerson, the SDLP's Matthew O'Toole, who will be the leader of the opposition at Stormont if and when it returns, and the Alliance MLA Saoirse Eastwood. By the way, we did invite the DUP, Sinn Féin and the Ulster Unionists to take part in this discussion, but as you can see, none of them are here. So welcome to all of you and thank you for joining us. Saoirse Eastwood, let's just set it out again so that everyone understands what we're talking about. There's no sign of Stormont coming back. A return to direct rule is widely ruled out. We can't expect the civil servants to run this place in perpetuity, but no one really knows what Plan B looks like. Is that it in a nutshell?
Well, Mark, we know what the plan is, and our plan has been out there for a long time. Our plan has been obvious, and that is reform of the institutions. And to save everybody time indulging in what has now become almost some sort of a parlour game, it's becoming increasingly clear that in the absence of the DUP breaking their deadlock in terms of coming back and forming an executive with the rest of us, that there does need to be action.
Right, so Plan A is still what everybody wants first, is that right? And that's still the Alliance Party's position. Plan A is ideal.
Obviously everybody is back around the table, but that being said, Mark, I don't know how much longer it's going to be tenable that we have this situation where clearly both governments, you can see there, are almost on an election footing. So clearly they will have an agenda elsewhere. What we're saying is we need to put Northern Ireland first.
Yeah, but does that mean inevitably that Plan B has to include some kind of say on the part of the Dublin government in the running of this place? Because that's what everybody thinks is, or not maybe everybody, but what a lot of people think is necessary under the circumstances. Well, look, you can't go back to old style direct rule.
No.
And under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, you've got to do something. Is that what we're looking at?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, from 1985, it's been long-term established UK government and Irish government positions from the time of the Anglo-Irish Agreement. I mean, I grew up under direct rule. De facto, over the last 10 odd years, whenever we've seen Sinn Féin collapse at the first time, and now the DUP, what we've seen is that kind of almost very fluid relationship in terms of that input. I don't think anybody's questioning that, and frankly, if they are, that's probably for the birds. But what we're saying is, rather than haggling over the British and Irish involvement, let's actually reform the institutions so we can come back tomorrow and actually do our job.
Okay, Matthew O'Toole, is what the SDLP wants effectively what your party leader called for last October, and that is what he called then joint authority?
Well, joint authority is one way of describing an enhanced role for the Irish government in the absence of devolution. I don't think that's unreasonable or surprising. I think it's important to take a step back and sort of assess where we are. So, sort of since really the early 1990s, there's always been a process. Largely been hugely positive for people in Northern Ireland and across these islands, that we've moved from conflict to peace, and then a political process which was pretty grinding and intermittently successful. But broadly, at most stages, there was a plan and people knew what was going to happen, and there were a broad set of expectations in Belfast, London and Dublin about where the thing was moving. At the minute, I'm not totally sure that we can say that such a process exists, because there's been this strange private cloistered conversation between the DUP and the Tory government about the terms on which the DUP might go back to Stormont.
Yeah.
It hasn't involved any of the other
Plan A. Obviously.
Well, it's part of Plan A. I mean, these sort of slightly theological terms, Plan A and Plan B, but the upshot is we don't know when we're going to have a devolved government back, because there's been this private conversation between the DUP and the British government none of the rest of us have been party to. But that isn't acceptable. Right. So in the absence of devolution, there has to be people setting out what their red lines are and how they see this place being governed in the absence of devolution. We think there has to be a role for the Irish government.
Okay, but if that is joint authority, that is a phrase, that is a term which obviously is discomfiting for unionists, and which a lot of people would say is also outside the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, which is something that the SDLP, of course, claims a very big hand in having established in the first place 25 years ago.
Very much so, Mark, but it's obviously incumbent on me to point out that there are three strands to the Good Friday Agreement, two of which are being blockaded, stymied, frustrated at the minute by the DUP, with, I'm afraid, the connivance or the complicity of the UK government. And now they may bring forward a deal and force the DUP to make a decision one way or the other, but the truth is that the Good Friday Agreement isn't being implemented or adhered to in any way at the minute, because we don't have strands 1 or 2, we don't have devolved government, we don't have a North-South Ministerial Council. In the absence of those things, I think it's pretty reasonable to expect that strand 3 does a little bit more work in order to ensure a little bit more inclusion in terms of government. Now, joint authority.
But nowhere in the Good Friday Agreement is there the phrase joint authority. Nowhere does it say if strands 1 and 2 don't work, and if devolution doesn't work as a project, then we go to this joint authority.
But there is a British-Irish intergovernmental conference. There is running through that document a clear insistence upon and elevation of the principle of inclusion and interdependence, which has been completely blown out of the water. Okay. So the idea that the Good Friday Agreement, is being upheld by others is, I'm afraid, simply, sadly, it clearly isn't. Okay. So in that context, I think it's important that we do set it. But let me go back to the Plan A point, since we're talking about Plans A.
Let me ask you this.
Our Plan A is that we re-establish institutions.
Okay, of course it is, and that's Plan A, and that's why it's Plan A. But are you talking about a scenario, if Plan A doesn't work, whereby the British and Irish governments would be engaged in a joint decision-making process about the governance of Northern Ireland?
There are different ways you could design it. I think it would be most obvious that it could, for example, meet under the auspices of the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference. Look, I should be clear. Let's be clear and be honest about what it wouldn't be. It wouldn't be joint sovereignty, and the Northern Ireland taxpayers would still pay their taxes to HM Revenue and Customs, etc., etc. And it wouldn't be a long-term destination. Obviously, my party is advocating for more fundamental constitutional change. But is it possible? Is it logistically feasible for there to be an enhanced form of consultation with the Irish government around significant decisions that are made? I don't think that's unreasonable or impossible.
So a creative approach, as Micheál Martin referred to.
Yes, a creative approach. But by the way, none of this is anyone's first preference, nor is it my long-term preference. Right. But I do think it's important to say that if you mentioned unionists being discomfited by this, I think everyone else, including many unionists, are discomfited by the situation we have at the minute. I also think that people are starting to ask questions about three things. Number one, Stormont reform, and sources write about that. Number two, if we don't have devolution, what role will the Irish government legitimately have? But then ultimately, the bigger question, and many more people, including the constitutional agnostic, are asking that about what constitutional change might look like if this place won't be allowed to work.
Okay, Newton, it's a complex picture, and I suppose it's a series of Venn diagrams in a sense, isn't it? We've got Plan A, we've got Plan B, we've tried to explain what they might be and what they might look like. What do you make of the debate? Because at the moment, nothing seems to be working very well.
Well, I think that Plan A, or Plan B, sorry, is effectively St Andrews 2. It is, we need a major reform of Stormont if it doesn't come back under the existing rules, and that would be a lengthy talks process that would be chaired jointly by London and Dublin through this British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference, as it was for nearly 5 years leading up to the St Andrews Agreement.
That assumes that there's an appetite for Stormont coming back.
Well, Stormont always comes back, and that really is the only long-term option that anyone is seriously.
Well, it's always come back so far, but that doesn't necessarily mean it'll come back the next time, does it?
The Good Friday Agreement requires it, unless we're going to completely renegotiate and ditch and renegotiate the Good Friday Agreement, which I don't think anybody is seriously talking about. So what the Taoiseach is mentioning about with his Plan B is really about this interim period. What do we do while, if necessary, we're having this negotiation? And there is joint British-Irish partnership in reaching that new reform process. However, the agreement says that the running of Northern Ireland can't be done through the conference. The conference cannot address devolved matters, and there's no derogation of British sovereignty. So there is a consultative role for Dublin, and that can be very important. And during the 5-year gap up to St Andrews, the good relationship between London and Dublin, between Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern's government, was, I think, as important as the institution in assuring nationalists that they weren't having a direct rule system that was completely pointed against them.
Let me ask you this.
But that's what's really missing here. The missing element here is the fact that London and Dublin are barely on speaking terms. So talking about developing an enhanced partnership is absurd when they can barely work the partnership that's there to be worked already.
Okay. As someone with a unionist worldview, do you accept this isn't any kind of a land grab by Dublin? The Irish politician that unionists dislike the least, the Taoiseach Micheál Martin, says it's simply a response, a practical, logical response to what's in front of us. Do you accept that, or do you see it as a threat?
Micheál Martin, perhaps. However, Leo Varadkar has an odd track record on this issue. As far back as 2017, he was ruling out direct rule. That seemed to have something to do with Brexit politics at that point. Now, having changed his lines on joint authority,
that's Leo Varadkar. He's a bit of a boogeyman for unionists. I'm asking you about Micheál Martin.
Well, he wasn't using the same terms as Leo Varadkar. I think that the two of them have not really made their Venn diagrams overlap about what they're talking about.
Well, they didn't use the same language, but they seem to get to the same place, do they not, in what they've said?
Are they talking about, are they talking about a direct role in the governance of Northern Ireland, as Leo Varadkar has mentioned, about health and education? No, that's simply not doable. And I think that if we start going down that road where you need to completely renegotiate the Good Friday Agreement, you're having a distraction from the negotiation that needs to be done about Stormont. We're getting lost down a rabbit hole.
Well, did Matthew not touch on it there? It's an enhanced role for Strand 3. It's what he called a creative approach to produce results that will benefit people living in Northern Ireland at a very difficult time. In areas like health and education.
Strand 3 specifically has no bearing on devolved issues, and it is there to consider the totality of relationships. It means it can manage a reform process. It can talk about problems with getting Stormont back up and running, but it can't run Northern Ireland. And if we're going to talk about that, then we can't anymore really talk about Stormont.
Well, maybe that's why he used the word, creative in inverted commas. I want to ask you about Lord Alderdice, the former Alliance Party leader. He's not a member of the party now, but he told the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee back in June that what we're looking at happening is what he called de facto joint authority. He talked about a situation coming about where old-style direct rule from London isn't going to happen again. There'll be consultation in that scenario with Dublin, and that amounts to de facto joint authority. I mean, Michelle O'Neill said you can call it whatever you want. You can call it working together. It doesn't really matter what language you use. I think we know what people are talking about.
Well, Mark, I think we do know what people are talking about, and they're not talking about this academic conversation tonight. It's very easy to lapse into these sorts of technical academic conversations, but we actually have a very clear pathway there, and that is what we have said. So look, I'll put
I don't think it's an academic conversation. It's about trying to explain, a complex issue. But it is about providing services for people in the absence of normal government.
And here's an example, right? So I was part of the talks team 2017 to 2020 that led up to NDNA, and obviously our asks then were the exact same as they are today, and that was around reform. That was looking at designations and parties like Alliance who are unaligned having a much fairer and equitable way in terms of the actual operation of the logistics of the institutions when it comes to designations and voting and everything else. And there was almost as if a sense of, you've got 8 MLAs, come back when you've got a bit more. And I think now not only have we smashed that target, but that's not what it's about. This is a mainstream conversation now, Mark, in terms of reform. You've heard Matthew reference it, you've heard Newton reference it, and it's there. It's a live conversation, and it's not something that has to be a huge, drawn out, overly laboured process. You're talking about other things like joint authority, for example, that you're saying aren't provided for in black and white in terms of the actual text, and that's fair enough, I agree. But what we do know is there is actually the capability to do reforms within. We've also talked about St Andrews. You could argue the point and say that certainly wasn't within the spirit of the GFA, but our reform proposals are.
Right. Well, let's talk about reform of the structures. Let's talk about bread and butter issues, because your party leader Naomi Long said last month, let me just quote her, "I see reform as an opportunity to deliver better public services, not necessarily cheaper, but more efficient and more effective." Now, that was a conversation about revenue raising. Are politicians here prepared to say that if we get back into Stormont under Plan A, that's what we're actually looking at? And there are going to be very difficult decisions for politicians to take, and maybe difficult consequences for people who live here.
Well, like Mark, what we're looking at the minute in terms of the fiscal situation, in terms of the economics of it, is a budget that has been set by the SOS, which clearly isn't grounded in terms of good fiscal housekeeping or actually helping the Northern Ireland economy. We have put forward proposals in terms of the Invest to Save plan. We have looked at how we actually tackle public services, because that is the number one issue that's there
but
now.
Naomi
for
Long
our
said that
voters and our
services
people.
could cost people more. So I suppose the question is, what service might get more expensive, by how much, and who's going to pay for it, or how is it going to be paid for?
And this is where we see the conversation going in terms of the Invest to Save piece, looking at stuff like, for example, the Barnett Squeeze, looking at establishing, a new fiscal floor. If we look at the need in terms of Northern Ireland to other DAs, other devolved assemblies across the UK, we know that flips on its head actually whenever we look at need in terms of Northern Ireland compared to other areas, and that isn't met at the moment. And actually the Fiscal Commission themselves have pointed that out. So we're looking at a situation where actually, yes, we do need to have reform, for example, and transformation within health, but for example, what we need to do at the same time is bring people with us and have those conversations, not just purely within the realms of DOH, for example, but looking at transport, looking at community health, looking at all those things. But Mark, without an assembly, without anything, we can't do that. And instead we have health and social care workers on picket lines, we have people languishing in waiting lists, and our proposals are there and on the table.
Matthew, if Stormont comes back, you would be the leader of the opposition, effectively. I mean, was the SDLP rubbing its hands at the prospect of your political opponents trying to explain to voters why services are going to cost them more in future?
We're certainly not rubbing our hands at all.
Well, you could make political capital out of it.
We don't want to. Well, we'd all like to get in and do our jobs and be politicians in the Northern Ireland Assembly. Mark, our job is to be politicians and to take decisions, and then to hold people to account for taking decisions. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing improper about that.
So is what Source Eastwood said right there, that services would cost more?
Well, Source has said quite a few things.
What I said was that we need to have a conversation about how we actually do it.
Okay,
which
well,
I'm sure
your party leader said it. Your party leader said it.
So in terms of where we are at the minute, and part of the reason why this is so frustrating is that what we have is something that's really hideously and preposterously anti-democratic, which is a Tory Secretary of State who does not have a mandate here, effectively trying to pressure the DUP by issuing a load of what are effectively threats, consulting on revenue-raising measures.
And it's having zero impact, apparently.
It seems to be, at the minute, having zero impact. It's a kind of strategy to punish people in Northern Ireland for decisions made by the DUP. Look, there is a conversation to be had about how Northern Ireland manages its finances better. There's also a conversation to be had about how we deliver public services better, because we clearly haven't done either of those things. It is definitely, however, completely inappropriate to threaten people in the middle of a cost of living crisis with a whole load of charges from a Secretary of State who doesn't have a mandate here and doesn't even want to take the responsibility for running services here to simply threaten a whole load of new charges and new revenue raising measures as a political stunt. I don't think that's acceptable. And really what it does is it gets to the heart of the democratic unacceptability of the position that the DUP have put us in.
It's hardly unprecedented, because this was how St Andrews was finally tied up. The Labour government threatened to bring in water charges, and the DUP and Sinn Féin, well, that was instrumental in bringing them to terms.
We have this very strange situation at the moment where the Secretary of State has now told senior civil servants to run a consultation on how additional revenue streams could be brought on board. That will presumably be presented to him, and he doesn't have the authority to do anything about it without legislation at Westminster.
Yes, he's going to leave those consultation responses for an incoming executive, and I think that's part of a negotiation.
Of which there is no sign.
It's part of him moving on the negotiation to Stormont's long-term finances, I think, from the punishment budget, when he's looking forward to perhaps when an executive is formed and starts asking for more money.
So which begs the question, doesn't it? Brings us back to, the square one again. Begs the question, why would any self-respecting politician want to go back to Stormont to implement those very difficult decisions?
Yes, well, look, we're getting stuck down in a parlour game again here. There's no point having any of these questions while the boycott facility is still there, because as we saw with welfare reform as well, once a difficult issue crops up, one of the other large parties will walk out, and that will be the end of it.
And
this is the absolute.
It's not a parlour game, though, folks, is it? This is real life for people who are watching at home.
It absolutely is, and Newton makes a really good point there about this kind of underlying issue, and that is this veto that is architecturally built in. That's what we're saying needs to be reformed and removed.
Last sentence, Matthew.
Two quick points about this. Number one, it is back to this point about, yes, about the veto and what the DUP are doing now, but it's also the case that politicians stand for election here to take responsibility. We have a problem here between taking power, seeking power, and parties not taking responsibility. That has to be at the heart of what we do going forward and how we change politics here. Because at the minute there are far too many who are desperate for power, but they really don't want to take responsibility, and it's more than the DUP, it's other parties too.
Okay, all right, need to leave it there. Thank you, all three of you, very much indeed for coming in to join us tonight. Now, Nordies versus Mexicans might be a crude way to capture the debate about relationships on this island, but there's an argument that it's still accurate, from the literary festival in Listowel in County Kerry last month to the bright lights of Dundrum man Paddy Keelty hosting the Late Show last week. The arguments on social media and in newspaper columns have been flowing thick and fast. In short, how Irish is a Northern Irish person, and how qualified is that person to take part in the national conversation on the island of Ireland? We'll hear about the writer Stephen Connolly's Listowel experience in a moment, but first, two views from Dublin, from Senators Emer Curry and Francis Black.
I had primary school and my 11 plus and first year grammar school in the north. I did secondary school in the south, and then I went to Queen's University in Queen's. It depends. So some people don't notice, some people love Northerners, but yeah, there can be some people do notice the northern thing more than others. Like I find because I am a real mix, and I see myself as an all of Islander, but in some ways when I go up north I'm seen as a Mexican, and when I'm in the south I'm seen as a Northie. So I belong everywhere and nowhere. But yeah, Northerners can, by certain people, yes, Northerners can be treated differently.
Partition did and has done create an unbelievable break between the north and the south. And what I mean by that is, I think, 1922, when partition happened, I think there was a huge abandonment of the north, and there's a huge shame and stigma that's attached to that, that's carried on down through the generations. So I think, in a way, certainly I feel that people down here can often, or the establishment can turn their back on the north for sure. If I remember rightly, when Martin McGuinness was down here doing, when he was on the RTE and he was going up for presidency, he was told to go back to his own country, and he was an Irish citizen. You know what I mean? So I think that's an example of how people would have seen it.
I just feel Northerners are a bit more direct. Sometimes it can get me into trouble, but I'm okay with that kind of good troublemaking.
I think that the conflict has had a huge impact on the people of the north. So they're hardier, tougher, stronger, and very determined. And they've had to, because it was survival.
Two views from Dublin, and let's pick up on them with Stephen Connolly, who was the curator of Listowel Writers' Week this summer, and Newton is staying with us too. So, Stephen, welcome. Your experience was well documented in the papers over the last few months, but you haven't talked about it on radio or television, so thank you for joining us tonight. Just to explain for the benefit of people who maybe missed it, what happened?
So, I was given a job as the curator or programmer for the oldest book festival in Ireland, which takes place every year in County Kerry. I was given the position after quite a dramatic restructure in the organisation, which was well documented in the national press at the time. I was coming in entirely fresh, and I'd like to say, first of all, that I found the town to be incredibly welcoming, and I made a lot of very good friends. But there were a lot of people who were aggrieved by this restructure process, and I wrote very briefly about the particular angle that some of their criticism of me personally took. And the earliest example when I arrived was when I was introduced to a group of people in a bar, kind of older men, in a lovely bar with a very welcoming staff. One of the men said, could they not have got somebody Irish to do it? And that it wasn't the defining experience what I had, but there was a pattern of that kind of criticism.
So that was not just a one-off, and you realised that your northernness was an issue for people there. And while there might have been other issues in the background that were problematic as far as the festival was concerned, it seemed to focus in on you, and you were getting the blame for what they didn't like, and it was because you were from the north.
Well, there were criticisms of the content of the festival programme, which
too northern,
and there were people phoning me from some of the Kerry newspapers afterwards, after my contract was up, asking about the criticisms that the programme was too northern. And I guess I'm not stupid enough to answer leading questions in that way, but I threw it back at them and said, well, where is this criticism coming from? Because the programme itself was not disproportionately northern.
Yeah, but and the northern figures who were taking part were, of course, very big names. I mean, like Paul Muldoon, who, of course, would be regarded as an Irish poet with an international reputation.
I mean, he's the professor.
He was there on merit.
He's the professor of poetry for Ireland. He's won a Pulitzer Prize, perhaps making him an American poet, because that particular prize requires American citizenship. In the final night of the festival, Paul Muldoon interviewed Paul Brady. And I think that Paul Brady's possibly one of the interesting ones in that he grew up in Strabane, and if he'd been born on the other side of the river or lived on the other side of the river in Lifford, would he have been more welcome at a festival 70 years later? Yeah,
it's a fascinating experience, isn't it, Newton? I don't know what you think it says about what people in the south think about people from the north. I just wonder what you make of what you have heard, and I wonder if you've come across it as a northern writer who writes for several southern publications.
I read about all these experiences online and in the press when you wrote about them, and my first reaction was that I have never had a bad experience in the Republic, or heard of anyone having a bad experience in the Republic, having grown up in a unionist community. And there was quite a lot of cross-border contact in Portadown, even during the Troubles, with churches and youth groups and just business. And I wonder, is that because, although it's only anecdotage, obviously, I wonder, is that because unionists don't expect to be treated as compatriots in the Republic? We have a different standard. We're not.
But it's not just about unionists. It's not northern unionists. It's all northerners, isn't it? I mean,
obviously, people in the Republic, I presume, can't tell how far apart our eyes are. We're all getting roughly the same reaction. But perhaps unionists are not as attuned to the nuances of being treated a little bit differently, or perhaps they just don't care.
Yeah, the Irish independent journalist John Downing wrote this week about challenging anti-Nordyism, as he put it, in Dublin, and we had hoped to talk to him in the programme. Unfortunately, he had to pull out out of the View tonight at short notice. But he focused in that article that he wrote about the reaction to Paddy Keelty's debut on the late last week. I mean, I wondered, did you look at some of that reaction, which again criticised the apparent alleged northernness of some of his guests, and did you make parallels between Paddy's experience maybe and yours?
I mean, if you were to search for Paddy Keelty's name on Twitter just after people are making comparisons with me directly, I'm not dogmatic about any of these things, and you look at if Paddy Keelty's from County Down, you look at somebody like Ciara McGeehan, who about 2 weeks ago broke Sonia O'Sullivan's long-standing, well, it was actually Ciara's own 1500 metre record, but she was wearing a green Ireland vest in the World Championships, and I don't think that because she's from County Down that makes her any less Irish or any less ready to represent Ireland on the world stage than Sonia O'Sullivan from Cork was.
But do you think that maybe people from the south look at somebody like Ciara McGeehan, look at somebody like yourself, look at somebody like Paddy Keelty, whether you're a unionist or a nationalist, or whether you're neither, as just a Nordy?
Yeah, I don't think that's for the most part. If somebody's going to be willing to criticise you for being from the north, I don't think it matters what your opinion on the constitutional future of this place will be.
Yeah, they're just not interested. I was talking to somebody else who's worked in Dublin for a lifetime in a fairly prominent position, who is from Northern Ireland, and who said that the problem is with people from the south who have this notion that they are the true Gaels, and they have a very specific idea of what Irishness is, and whether you're a unionist or a nationalist, and if you come from the north, you don't fit that definition, and that's it. You're not Irish. You are other.
Was there always an otherness about Ulster before Northern Ireland existed?
I don't know, you tell me. Well, neither of us, none of the three of us were around to know for sure, but maybe. Maybe. I don't know. Do you think that's an issue?
I think that if you are to reduce the idea of a nationality down to a set of cultural markers, you're on a losing road anyway. Yeah. I think that anybody who thinks in ways like that probably isn't in a position to gatekeep who's Irish and who isn't.
But I think it's interesting because if you were to look at this from, I suppose, the other end of the telescope, you would maybe say that the 26 counties, the Republic of Ireland, welcomed President Mary McAleese from Belfast as president for 2 terms and holds her very dearly. And she was one of Paddy Keelty's guests, of course, on the Late Late Show on Friday night.
I think the point is here, I think that perhaps nationalists from Northern Ireland are very attuned to dismissive remarks and in the Republic perhaps far more attuned than unionists would be, because it's very important to them to be treated as compatriots. But perhaps there's not even a direct parallel between how unionists expect to be treated in Britain.
Okay, we've about 30 seconds left. How do we challenge this? How do we deal with it? Or do we just ignore it?
I think that any time there's any talk of, if there is talk of the future for this island, that it's never a case that it's going to be assimilation of us into something that is pre-existing. And I think that we make sure that everybody has an equal part in any conversation.
And
how you do that?
So people need to speak up, I suppose, and people maybe need to listen as well. It's not about speaking; it's about listening.
I think you've hit the nail on the head.
It's always about listening, Newton, isn't it, rather than speaking? Yeah. Okay. All right. We'll leave it there, folks. We've scratched the surface. Thanks both very much indeed. That is it for tonight. But I'll be back this weekend with Sunday Politics as usual at 10 o'clock on BBC One. Do join me for that. For now, though, from everyone in the team, thanks for watching. Have a good night. From all of us. Bye bye.